you need to be paying attention to what's happening in Sudan. Hiding corpses, raping doctors, and at least 100 people killed. These are just some of the reports coming out of Sudan. Protesters are facing a brutal crackdown at the hands of their own military after months of protests. Here's what you need to know about what's been going on. The protests started in December 2018, when civilians began taking to the streets in the city of Atbara. At first, the anger was over soaring bread and fuel prices, but very quickly they grew into anti-government protests. The authorities reacted quickly in an attempt to appease protesters, changing the policy and imposing a state of emergency in Atbara with a curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. But it was too little, too late. By the next day, demonstrators were on the streets of the capital Khartoum, with other cities chanting for freedom, peace, and justice. And you can't underestimate the scale of these protests. People came from all backgrounds, ages, genders, classes, all united in their desire to depose President Omar al-Bashir after a 30-year rule over the country.
From the start, the Sudanese people have been clear about what their demands are and what they want. We want freedom, peace, and justice. We want freedom from military rule and from tyranny and oppression. And we want the freedom to choose our own government, and a government that represents us truly.
The marches were led by the Sudanese Professionals Association, or the SPA, which is an umbrella coalition for professional unions. Doctors, journalists, lawyers, pharmacists from all across the country also took part in nationwide strikes as called on by trade unions and professional associations.
People coming together like this contributed ultimately to the sustainability of the movement and of the sit-ins.
The movement is really refusing everything the regime, al-Bashir regime, had produced over 3 decades, which are restrictions of their freedom, more wars, and lack of justice at every single level in the state.
At first, Bashir stood firm against the calls for his resignation and tried to curb demonstrations.
لكن إذا اضطريت في النهاية إذا استخدام السلاح من أجل أن تثبت الأمن الناس اضطرت يستخدموا لكن برضو بمبدأ استخدام أقل قوة ممكنة.
On the 22nd of February, he announced a 1-year state of emergency. The presidential decree banned protests, public gatherings, and political activities. And it also gave the police and security forces more power to monitor individuals and carry out inspections. In early April, the Interior Ministry said 39 people had died since protests began, but a spokeswoman for the SPA put the death toll at nearly 70. On the 6th of April, these protests reached a climax. Demonstrators occupied the square outside of the military headquarters, demanding that the army force the president to resign. It's thought to be the largest sit-in in Sudanese history.
These sit-ins were a safe space for people to come together and discuss and to build and organize and dream of a better and more united Sudan. It also gave people the opportunity to reach across tribal lines, to reach across socioeconomic lines and build relationships in a country like Sudan that is incredibly diverse, but also incredibly divided, and on purpose.
The sit-in was really a manifestation of how they see the peace and justice and freedom really materializes. There were people like donating internet access, and they used to have big bags of money asking people, if you don't have money, take, if you have money, put. There was this trust, and I think that was one of the amazing values that this revolution has reinstated again. It brought back this trust in the collective, the trust in self.
And it worked. 5 days later, the army announced that Bashir was gone.
وتحملت المسؤولية الكاملة لتغيير كل نظام لفترة انتقالية لمدة عامين.
But this then created new tensions. With Bashir no longer in the picture, then rose the question over how to move forward and who should be in power. On the 11th of April, a Council of Generals took charge of Sudan, otherwise known as the Transitional Military Council. The announcement was given by the country's Vice President, General Awad ibn Auf, who was also the head of military intelligence and security during the bloody conflict in Darfur, a war that claimed over 300,000 lives. In 2009, the International Criminal Court indicted Bashir for his alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in Darfur. Ibn Auf himself was sanctioned by the United States for supporting and managing militias accused of carrying genocide in the conflict. But his appointment didn't last long, following strong backlash from protesters.
دي مسرحية ما في إزالة للنظام دي إعادة إنتاج للنظام وما مقبول بالنسبة لنا إحنا في الشارع هنظل قاعدين ولحد ما النظام ده يتغير بكل رموزه بشير على ابن عوف على غيره نحن دايرين زول تسقط تاني أصل غير كده ما دايرين.
Less than 24 hours after he was sworn in, Ibn Auf stepped down from the post and was replaced by Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Al-Burhan promised to oversee a transitional period that will last a maximum of 2 years. However, protesters accuse the leaders of being close to Bashir and say they are part of the problems that instigated the demonstrations in the first place.
Awd ibn Auf was responsible for sending Sudanese troops to Yemen. You have Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is infamous for his involvement in the Darfur conflict. And you have Hemeti, who is world famous for being the leader of the Janjaweed, who are now known as the Rapid Support Forces, but they are the forces that committed the atrocities in Darfur. So all of these things just don't inspire any confidence or faith, and in fact only prove that the regime has yet to fall. And their presence is frankly an insult to Sudanese people's intelligence.
That the political atmosphere in Sudan is not governed solely by people in Sudan, especially when it comes to the political leadership. The proxy stakeholders, we're dealing with UAE, we're dealing with Saudi Arabia, we're dealing with the EU, we're dealing with the US. Each and every one of those countries or coalition or countries have an interest in having the status quo in Sudan.
While protest leaders met with the Council for negotiations a few times, they broke down as the opposition insisted that a civilian must head the transitional body. And so, the sit-in and strikes continued in order to put pressure on the military leaders. Then, the most deadly crackdown happened. On June 3rd, a crackdown began that saw at least 100 people killed and hundreds injured as security forces firing live ammunition moved to disperse the protest camp outside of the army headquarters.
They shot at them, they whipped them, they caned them, they tortured them in the street, they detained and tortured them, they raped the women they could find. And once they were done with Nile Street, they drove in through the main sit-in area and lit the tents where people, protesters, were sleeping on fire.
Eyewitnesses claim to have witnessed the paramilitaries throwing corpses into the river, and they also claim that the paramilitary group and other forces had shot at hospitals, flogged demonstrators with whips, and set alight to protest tents. There have also been accounts of soldiers raping female doctors and protesters. The Health Ministry also said that 61 people were killed on the first day of the crackdown, and 49 of them from live ammunition in Khartoum. Amnesty International called for international action against Sudan's new military rulers and condemned the government's Rapid Support Forces, also known as the RSF, a paramilitary force that controls Khartoum and who led the sit-in dispersal, for what it called a murderous campaign. The SPA has said it rejects the move for a governmental investigation committee looking into the deaths. Meanwhile, Hemeti has said that the investigation has begun and that any person who crossed boundaries had to be punished. Despite all of this, protesters have remained defiant and have found new ways to voice their demands. Meanwhile, the military has blamed protesters for the deteriorating situation and has vowed to deploy security forces to restore order. Now, all eyes are on Sudan as its civilians fight to create a different future for their country.